This is Hippocampus, a truly miraculous structure which encodes memories and constructs maps of external world. How it does it still remains a mystery, but recently there have been some fascinating progress towards decoding the hippocampus. One of such aspects is the inner hippocampal clock called the Theta rhythm, which makes a bulk of computations possible. And the ticking of this clock is vital for memory encoding and retrieval. In this video, we will explore what the theta wave is, how it's generated, and the role it plays in the functioning of the brain. Without further ado, let's dive straight into it. Ever since Hans Berger discovered the alpha wave by putting electrodes on top of a person's head and measuring the electrical activity in what's now known as EEG, scientists have been interested in the phenomenon of brain waves, these oscillatory patterns of brain activity. By now we know quite a zoo of different brain rhythms with different frequency bands. Today I'd like to focus mainly on the theta wave, which is localized to the hippocampus. This characteristic wave-like pattern, with a frequency between 4 and 12 Hz, is recorded by sticking an electrode inside the hippocampus and measuring the voltage between a point in extracellular space and a ground electrode, usually somewhere at the top of the skull. This voltage arises from the summation of currents which reflect synchronous synaptic inputs. That is, when one neuron sends information to another through synapses. If there is a huge number of neurons surrounding the electrode and sending signals simultaneously, then these tiny individual currents add up and the resulting voltage becomes large enough to be sensed by the electrode. Note that this measures an overall activity of a huge number of neurons surrounding the electrode. It's like putting a microphone above the football stadium. It's not possible to discern when and what individual people are saying. You can only hear the overall activity of the crowd, which would increase every now and then when one of the teams scores. And similarly with neurons. In the intact brain, this rhythm is generated in a special structure called medial septum. It contains what's known as pacemaker neurons, which rhythmically discharge between 4 and 12 times per second. They have special proteins, hyperpolarization activated channels, which allow ions to flow into the cell at regular time intervals, thus generating a rhythmic activity. It's actually the same mechanism which makes your heart beat. Pacemaker neurons send their connections to the hippocampus, thus sending the rhythmic output and giving rise to the theta wave. This way, the activity of hippocampal network waxes and wanes following the rhythm of a conductor, the medial septum. Just a quick note. It's worth mentioning that the reality is a bit more complex than that. Particularly, in 2009 it was discovered that even if you isolate the hippocampus by cutting the connections from the medial septum, under certain conditions, theta rhythm can be generated inside the hippocampus itself. It indicates that the hippocampus contains a neuronal machinery that is enough for the generation of intrinsic rhythm. Like an experienced orchestra can self-organize to play in harmony, even without the conductor. In this scenario, rhythmic activity arises due to the interaction between excitatory and inhibitory neurons through a negative feedback loop. The mechanism is quite elegant, but it's a bit beyond the scope of this video. If you're interested, I encourage you to check out the references down in the video description. The current view is that the hippocampus, although it has an intrinsic oscillator, something that can generate rhythmic activity, normally follows the beat of medial septum. The exact details of this process are still a matter of debate. But without a doubt, this rhythmic activity of hippocampal network is essential to carry out a bulk of computations. So let's explore the functions of this mysterious theta wave. Just like any other brain rhythm, theta is not always present. Instead, it is observed under a specific physiological state, namely during periods of locomotion, which is just a fancy term for running, exploratory sniffing, and other environment-related behaviors. For example, when the animal is sitting still and grooming, theta activity in the hippocampus would be absent or really sparse. You wouldn't see this low frequency component in the brain activity. However, when it starts to run and search for food, its hippocampus would light up with this rhythmic theta wave. And spatial navigation is closely linked to memory formation. Because when you are a mouse, for example, and you successfully find a route to a food source, it is important to memorize that route and retrieve it next time. I'd like to make an argument, which is actually the central topic of the entire video, that the main function of theta rhythm is providing a computational mechanism to construct and retrieve memory traces. Alright, let's unpack what the hell was that. Essentially, we can think of a memory as a temporal sequence of neuronal patterns activating one after another. And each one of those patterns is a collection of neuronal assemblies, which together form an integrated representation of the external world at a particular point in time. This integrated representation encodes different modalities of the experience, things like the current position, sensory cues, emotional state, social interactions, etc. Each of these modalities has a corresponding pattern of brain activity, a neuronal fingerprint, so to speak. A great example of such is the concept of plate cells. If you're interested, I have a separate video on this topic. But essentially, certain pyramidal neurons in the hippocampus show spatial specificity. Each neuron has a preferred location in the environment and fires when the animal is located in that particular patch of ground. This forms a code of physical position. But hippocampus has been shown to code non-spatial variables as well, such as sound frequency and even people identities for the case of humans. This way, every experience, every episodic memory has all of these modalities. And to form an integrated representation of external world, the brain has to link all of them together into a single picture. Theta rhythm is the mechanism to ensure that all these separate components are linked together to form a unified memory. Another computational problem is to arrange these instantaneous representations into a temporal sequence to form a meaningful memory which unfolds in time. This sequential organization, which is inherently one-dimensional, is fundamental for both spatial navigation, because each trajectory can be thought of as a sequence of play cells, and episodic memory in general. And theta rhythm helps to form a chain of representations, ensuring the correct temporal order. Now, I know it was a lot to take in. Hopefully, things will become a bit more clear when we discuss each of the functions separately. Let's begin with a thought experiment. Alice and Bob are childhood friends who haven't seen each other in a long time. One day, they randomly bumped into each other in the bank, but because both were busy, they decided to meet later in their favorite coffee shop to discuss all the hot news. Now, suppose they don't have the internet or phones or any other means to communicate with each other than face-to-face interaction. How can they possibly make the meeting at the coffee shop happen? Well, one way is to agree on the place like they did, and then occasionally visit it every once in a while. There is a small chance that they will both arrive there at the same time to finally sit down and talk. But I think you'll agree that it's not very efficient. The other way, which is quite intuitive to us, is to agree on time in advance. If both of them know that they are meeting tomorrow at 1 p.m. in the original Joe's Coffee, there is no ambiguity left. In other words, even if they don't communicate with each other directly, they can use an external factor in the form of time, which they have both access to in order to coordinate their arriving. In the ancient times, when clocks were not invented, people used the position of sun for the exact same purpose. In the hippocampus, the theta rhythm, and in particular its phase between 0 and 360 degrees, is used as this kind of clock, an external agent which all neurons can listen to and coordinate their spiking activity. Because for the brain to link two assemblies together, such as ones representing where and with whom. Spikes from their neurons should arrive at the receiver neuron in a very small time window, with a short interval between each other. That way, theta oscillation provides a temporal reference frame, which neurons can use to adjust the timings of their spikes in order to carry out information transfer more effectively. And the reason why theta rhythm activates during locomotion and other exploratory behaviors is that spatial behavior means navigation and memory encoding, so we need to constantly form integrated representations of environments. In our experiment, this means that all of a sudden everyone has a lot of catching up to do with their old friends. So the global timing mechanism is recruited for hundreds of Alices and Bobs to coordinate their arrivals all over the town. It is an online state of the hippocampus. But this is only half of the story about the theta rhythm. We have successfully combined different modalities into a unified picture of the external world. So all the information about location, visual and auditory cues, social interaction is linked together. However, this representation is only a stationary snapshot of external world at some point in time, like a freeze frame when you press pause on a movie. It doesn't have any information about what happened before or what will happen in the future, and in that configuration it is of very little use to the brain. Because what constitutes a meaningful episodic memory is the chaining of these neuronal assemblies into a temporal sequence, the same way as pressing play turns a collection of stationary frames into an engaging movie. Essentially, there are two possible mechanisms how this chaining of assemblies can happen in the brain. The first one is externally generated sequences, which arise when the incoming sensory information already has a sequential organization. For example, suppose you are walking through a corridor whose walls are colored in gradient, so in the beginning it's red, a bit further it's yellow, and so forth. In that case, visual information, which is organized as a succession of changing colors, evokes a chain of corresponding representations in the brain. Alternatively, and this is much more interesting, an assembly sequence can be driven internally, with little or no incoming sensory cues. For example, if you were to lie down, close your eyes, and recall the experience of walking through that rainbow corridor. In that case, the sequence of representations is generated by intrinsic mechanisms of the brain, connectivity patterns, and synaptic strengths between members of the assembly itself, if the activation of first assembly leads to the activation of the second, and so forth. But it turns out that theta rhythm is essential for the generation of the latter type internally driven sequences, since abolishing theta rhythm severely affects the emergence of this type of sequential activity, which is normally observed during planning and memory retrieval. To better understand this, let's return to our thought experiment. Now suppose that all these pairwise encounters between people should happen in a strict temporal succession, like on couples therapy. First, Alice and Bob go in at 10 AM. Then after them, Claire and Dan at 11 AM, and so forth. In that case, time, just like before, serves to coordinate arrivals of individuals within a couple. But at the same time, external clock is used to separate different sessions in time, to ensure they happen one after another in a well-defined order. Otherwise, it would be kind of awkward if all four people would sit there at the same time. Similarly, theta rhythm provides a mechanism to arrange experiences into a temporal sequence. And just like before, it is the phase of the wave which is used as the coordination parameter. Because neurons adjust timings of their spikes to the ticking of the hippocampal clock, episodic memories can unfold in a meaningful temporal succession instead of being jumbled together. To give you a concrete example, let's discuss an important phenomenon which was discovered last century called phase precession. I've already mentioned how a path through environment can be represented as a sequential activation of place cells, specialized neurons encoding physical location. Each of those cells has a preferred patch of ground, called the place field, where it fires most actively. And when the animal enters the place field, reaches the center and then leaves it, the firing rate of that neuron, which is just a number of spikes it spits out per second, would gradually increase, reaching the maximum value at the center of the place field, and then go down. This constitutes so-called rate coding, when information about position is encoded in what neuron is spiking and with what rate. But it turns out that the phase of theta rhythm at which a neuron spikes also matters for the information transfer. This is what's known as phase coding. More specifically, if you were to record activity of individual neurons, as well as the surrounding theta rhythm, you'd see something quite bizarre. As the animal moves through the place field of a neuron, its spikes would occur at earlier and earlier phases of theta. In other words, the phase precesses along with movement. And if you consider other place cells and look at their spiking relative to each other, you'd see that the order of spikes within one theta cycle, that is, the time window between the two peaks, recapitulates the exact order of place fields on the portion of the trajectory. Peak firing rate, which corresponds to the center of the place field, is observed at the trough of the theta wave, around 180 degrees. Recent past is represented by the firing of neurons whose place fields the animal has just left, occurs at earlier phases of theta, and the near future, spikes of neurons whose place fields the animal is only about to enter, would unfold at later phases of theta. This way, each theta cycle bears information about past, present and future in a proper order. And as the animal moves and theta rhythm progresses, the representations would shift accordingly along the wave to maintain this time-phase relationship. You can see how theta cycle contains little temporally organized segments of experience. Supposedly, these pieces of a bigger puzzle, which are called theta sequences, are later stitched together to encode a full memory. Let's now tie everything together. In this video, we explored the phenomenon of theta rhythm, an oscillatory pattern of brain activity resulting from summation of individual currents flowing in the network. Basically, the theta rhythm functions as an internal hippocampal clock, helping to coordinate the firing of individual neuronal assemblies during memory operations. This way, theta rhythm underlies cognitive chunking and storage of events in their correct spatially temporal order. In humans, similar mechanisms can be employed during the formation of semantic memories and gaining of more abstract knowledge, which brings me to our today's sponsor. Shortform is an awesome platform for anyone who wants to make the most out of their reading experience. They offer supercharged book summaries, which describe the book's key ideas, enhanced by interactive exercises and nicely supplemented by information from related sources. I'm a huge fan of this feature because such intermixing is essential if you want to get a comprehensive picture of the topic. Shortform publishes new book guides every week from a variety of genres, such as science, health, technology, and many others. Reading the detailed summary is not a substitute for reading the book itself, but it can certainly help discover relevant sources and serve as a reading companion, because when you are familiar with the summary, you know what to pay more attention to. If you would like to join, use a link down in the description to get 5 days of unlimited access and 20% discount on annual membership. Of course, we are still very far from having a comprehensive picture describing the internal workings of hippocampus and the brain in general. So there is still a lot to research and a lot to explore. Stay tuned for more interesting stuff coming up. Until then, if you liked the video, share it with your friends Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and press the like button. Goodbye, and thank you for the interest in the brain.